Hi guys, welcome to the Art of Server. So in today's video, I'm going to kick off a series of 3 videos that will show you how to upgrade the storage subsystem of the R820. Now, because the R820 also shares the chassis with the R720, basically they're more or less identical, it's just the internals are different. Some of these upgrade options I'm going to show you will also apply for the R720. I have here my R820 and I've got some enterprise grade SAS2 SSDs. I believe these are 400 gigabyte drives and I've got 8 of them. And right now I have this configured in kind of the Dell stock form. So coming directly from Dell when these were brand new, the R820 basically had 2 storage or primary storage options. I think you could do other things as well, but there were primarily 2 storage options. There was an H710 and then there was an H710P. And as you know, the H710 is a RAID controller. Those are actual hardware RAID controllers. And the difference between the plain H710 and the H710P was that the P, I believe, was for performance, and it had double the amount of cache on it. And so you could, basically get better performance out of it. Now, this was back when things like ZFS and software storage technologies were not as popular yet. Now, of course, Sun Microsystems had been using ZFS for years and years before that. But for most people who were buying Dell servers at the time, using ZFS and stuff like that was not really a consideration. And so Dell didn't really offer any IT mode HBA options as storage controllers for their 12th generation lineup. On the R720, if you recall from about a year ago, I figured out how to flash the H310 Mini and H710 Mini with IT mode firmware, and thus presenting you guys with IT mode SAS controllers that fit in the mini monolithic slot. And so if you have an R720 or any other rack mount 12th generation Dell server, that's probably the option you want to go look at. And I made a video specifically explaining how to choose between those 2 options. And so I'll put a card up in the corner for you to check that out. But the R820 was the one model in that lineup that did not have a mini monolithic slot. And so the SAS controller in the R820 is actually just a normal PCIe card that sits in one of the riser slots. And so upgrading the R820 to IT mode basically requires you to swap out that controller, but you cannot use a IT mode mini monolithic card in the R820. So today's upgrade, in this first video, what I'm going to show you is how to convert the R820 to IT mode so that for you guys who are running something like Proxmox, because this R820 is a 4-socket server with tons and tons of memory. It's an incredible platform for virtualization. So you might want to run a hypervisor like Proxmox, and in that case, because Proxmox has support for ZFS, you might be wanting to use these SSDs or these 8 bays, or there's also a 16 bay model. You might be wanting to use those with ZFS, and so you need to convert the SAS storage subsystem to IT mode instead of using a hardware RAID controller. And so I'm going to show you how to do that today, what parts I'm going to choose to do that, and what's involved. And we'll also log in. I've got my USB drive with a CentOS 7 with ZFS on it, and so we can try out configuring these SSDs with ZFS and see what kind of performance level we can get out of these SSDs with an IT mode controller. All right, so let's go ahead and open this guy up and take a look at where the RAID controller is, and then I'll show you what card I'm going to use to upgrade, well, it's not technically an upgrade, but convert this system to an IT mode SAS controller. All right, guys, so now we're inside the R820. You can see this is an awesome machine. It's got 4 sockets, 2 on the top motherboard, 2 more sockets on the bottom motherboard, and just tons and tons of memory banks. So again, this is a wonderful platform to run a hypervisor virtualization setup. Now, the storage backplane is over here. You can see these are SAS cables that go around and come over here and plug into this card right over here. Now, this is the Dell H710 RAID controller. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. I'm going to show you what I'm going to put in its place in order to convert this system to a IT mode HBA type of storage subsystem. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and pull this card out now. If you've watched my other R820 videos, this card is a little bit tricky to install because everything is just so crammed in here. It's such a tight fit. What I find is that I usually want to leave these cables attached to the controller, and usually I'll install the cables first before I even insert the card. And so when I'm removing this, first thing I want to do is just kind of loosen up the cables over here, just so they have some room to move around and they're not stuck in the cable management channels. And so from there, I just need to pull the card out and kind of twist it a little bit with the cables attached. And then once the cable is out, it's easier to reach down in here and pull or press on the latch mechanism of these SFF 8087 connectors and pull them out. And so usually that's what I'll do. I'll pull the card out first before I pull off the cables. All right, so this is the Dell H710 RAID controller. And as you can see, there is a battery pack here that protects the data that's in the cache. The cache chips are actually right underneath this. And so this is the H710. And the card we're going to replace it with is this one right here. So this is a hardware-wise, this is an LSI SAS2308 SAS controller with IT mode firmware on this. And this is often known as the 9207-8i. And there's also an HP version of this that's called the H220, and it's often labeled 9205-8i. And those are basically identical cards. I have both of them. I've compared them visually, and they just look completely identical, other than that the HP one usually has an HP logo sticker right there and an HP logo on the bracket there. But otherwise, they're hardware-wise, they are the same. And in fact, this card is a Dell branded one. I don't know if I can show you in the camera here. Let's see if we can get that. If I can't get that to focus in the camera, I'll put up a picture of it. But this is actually a Dell part number, and the Dell part number is VGXKD. All right, so if you guys want to do this upgrade, I have these cards in my store. I'll leave a link in the video description so you can go check that out. All right, so now you can see that this is a really, really nice fit as an alternative to the H710 because they are almost identical in form factor, right? So other than this card being a little bit shorter on this end, they are basically the same form factor with the connectors kind of more or less in the same location. This is again a little bit shorter, maybe by about 1/3 of an inch. That's a little bit more inset than on the H710, but that should be fine. In fact, I'll probably give us a little bit more room to wiggle around the SAS connections. All right, so let's go ahead and install this. So let me go put this guy away first. And I'm going to go ahead and install this. And like I said, I usually like to install these guys first by connecting the cables, just because there's just not a lot of room to move and get underneath here. So I'm going to connect the two SAS connectors first, and then just as I remove the H710, I'm going to go in at a slight angle. And one thing you want to pay attention to is this notch in the corner here. There's a little plastic notch that's meant to hold the PCB board, and so you want to make sure to slide the corner of the PCB board into that notch and align the PCI slot with the PCI connector on the card, and then just press it in just like that. All right, and so we already have the SAS cables attached, and all we have to do is kind of make sure the SAS cables go back into their little cable management channel, and we are pretty much done. I'll just secure the PCI bracket with that little plastic retention bracket thing. All right, and so that's it, guys. That's all we need to do to upgrade a R820 to IT mode. Now I'm going to boot this guy up with this card installed, and we'll log in on the virtual terminal, and I'll kind of show you that all the drives show up, and we'll create a test ZFS pool and run a benchmark just to get an idea of what kind of performance we can expect out of a setup like this with this VGX KD 9207-8i SAS controller with the 8 SAS2 enterprise grade SSDs that I have in here. All right, so let me close this guy up and fire it up, and we'll go on the virtual console and check that out. All right, guys, I've got the iDRAC interface pulled up. The server is on, and let's go ahead and log in here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the virtual console app. Okay, so we got this up and running here. I'm going to go ahead and power on the server now. And it's going to take a while because that server has 1.5 terabytes of RAM. It takes quite a while to boot up. So while that's doing that, I'm going to switch over to this spreadsheet I created and kind of explain the methodology that I'm going to use for the benchmarking that we're going to do today. So as you recall, I have 8 SSDs in there. They are the SmartStore SAS2 400 gigabyte SSDs, and I'm going to be testing them in 3 different configurations. So one, I'm going to test a single drive, and this is just going to give me a baseline of the performance of a single drive. Next, I'm going to test 8 of those SSDs in a RAID 0, and this is just for maximum performance. Obviously, this is probably not a configuration that you might want to use in a real kind of production environment, but just to kind of get a sense of the total performance capability of the system, we're going to test a RAID 0 setup of all 8 SSDs. And finally, we're going to set up a ZFS RAID Z2 with those 8 SSDs. And that has redundancy, so this is a more realistic scenario of how one might want to set up those SSDs. So anyway, those are the 3 different test cases that we'll examine today. And for each of those test cases, we're going to do a series of different tests. So one is going to be very rudimentary, using DD to just do some sequential writing and sequential reading at 1 megablock sizes, or 1 megabyte blocks. Now, DD is not a great benchmark. It doesn't necessarily tell you a whole lot, but it's kind of a easy thing to do that is easy to compare, and you can, a lot of people do it, so it's just convenient for comparison's sake. But don't take the numbers you get with a DD run as kind of the ultimate, truth of performance. It's just there kind of just to see if you are within the ballpark or not. Okay. But what I'm going to do after the DD sequential read and writes is I'm going to run IO zone to do some real benchmarking test, and we'll do some sequential writes, sequential reads, random writes, random reads, and I'm going to use 1 megabyte record sizes for testing kind of large file, IO patterns. And then I'm also going to repeat those tests with 4K record sizes, which would simulate something that's a little bit more kind of small block size, small files, or maybe like database type of access, or that type of stuff. So we're going to get both perspectives on this. And I especially like to do these kind of small tests, especially with the random reads and writes when we're working with SSDs, because you can really kind of flex the muscle of the SSDs with the random IOPS. All right, so those are the different tests that we're going to run for each of those test cases. Okay. All right, and so as we record all that, I've got this chart set up, so we'll be able to kind of see a little graphic of how all that compares. All right, so let's go back to the console screen here. Like I said, this is going to take quite some time, so I may just let this run, and I'll kind of fast forward it through in the video. Alright guys, one thing I do want to mention is that, like I said, this machine has 1.5 terabytes of RAM, and Linux does a really good job at trying to use as much of that RAM to cache disk I/O. And so in order to avoid the effects of that caching, since there's just so much RAM, in order to kind of overcome it, you would have to write over 1.5 terabytes of data, and I just don't want to put all that wear on my SSDs unnecessarily. So what I'm going to do is change some of the boot parameters here, and I'm going to change the amount of addressable memory by the kernel to 8 gigs. And so that way, basically, it will not have access to that much memory. We'll be able to minimize the effects of caching by the Linux kernel. All right, so we have mem equals hg, so that'll give us 8 gigabytes of addressable memory. And we'll go ahead and hit Control X, and we'll go ahead and boot up with that setting. All right, so we are booted up. I'll go ahead and log in. And let's just confirm that, yes, so we have less than 8 gigs of memory. And let me just get the IP address of the machine, so it's 210. And we'll log in with SSH. And on the lower right side, I'm going to run top. And as you can see, we have 32 cores of CPUs in here. And these are actual cores. The processor I have in here does not do hyperthreading. So let me kind of get rid of that view here so that we can actually see the processes. And on the upper right, I'm going to run IO stat so that we can see the IO that's happening on each of the drives. All right, so first thing, let's just confirm that we have the LSI controller. So indeed we do. We have a 2308 LSI controller here in IT mode. As you can see here, it is identified as a serial attached SCSI controller. If we run lsscsi, you'll see that I can see all 8 of my SSDs. All right, so first thing I want to do is test the performance of a single drive. And so I'm just going to, let's say, pick H. So let's go ahead and we'll create a label and a partition across the entire disk. All right, so now I'll just create a file system. Oh, all right, let's force that. All right, and I'm going to mount that under /mnt. And here we are with the 400 gigabyte drive mounted under /mnt. All right, so let's go in there. And the first thing I'm going to do is just run the DD test that we talked about. So I'm going to run it with DD status equals progress in from dev 0 out to mnt. I'll just call it a file named speed test, block size 1 megabytes, count. Let's go ahead and just do 10 gigs. And I'm going to use the O flag for direct. So this flag will basically direct or tell DD to bypass all the buffers. And so we're minimizing the effects of caching and that kind of stuff. So, all right, let's go ahead and run this. So over here on the right, you can see that we are writing somewhere between 400 and, well, 430 to 480 megabytes per second here. It kind of fluctuates a little bit. Oh, down here we can see that DD is using about 7 to 12% of CPU, so we're not maxing out on processor capability there. All right, so the result we got here is 472 megabytes per second. And so the first thing I'm going to do after this is I'm going to drop all the caches. Then we're going to read that back. And send that to dev null. And so that'll give us kind of a sequential read performance. All right, so over here we see the 534 megabytes per second from IOStat. Alright, so we ended up with 559 megabytes per second with the DD test. Alright, so let's go ahead and record this. Alright, so I'm going to run IOZone, and we're going to utilize all 32 cores. And so we're going to launch 32 threads, one thread per core basically. So since we have 32 threads, I'm not going to have them use a really large file. Usually I would choose a file that was large enough to overcome any kind of possible caching effects and stuff like that. But in this case, I'm going to just use 256 megabyte files. And with 32 threads, each creating a 256 megabyte file, that means our total data set is going to be about 8 gigabytes. All right, so we're going to do a test with 1 megabyte records first. We'll do the write test, the sequential write test, sequential read test, and then the random IO, which is read and write both. We're going to launch 32 threads. We'll use a stride of 64. I'm going to record CPU utilization, so that's what the dash plus U is. And I'm going to use dash I, which basically enables, again, the direct IO flag. And in past benchmarks, you might have noticed that I did not use this dash capital I option, and that was because at the time I believe ZFS did not support this particular flag. And so, you know, if you ran it with that flag, it would just basically error out. XFS does support that. That's kind of where direct IO, I think, came from. But anyway, ZFS does support it now, so it's safe to use this option with IOZone with both ZFS and other file systems. So anyway, this is the test I'm going to run, and this should give us all the results for the 1 megabyte record, and then we're going to rerun this test with 4K. Alright, so the benchmark is done. Let's go ahead and record these results. Okay, so now we're going to repeat this test with 4K record sizes. Alright, so that run is now done. Let's go ahead and record that. Alright, so just to kind of briefly look over these numbers, you can see that the sequential read and write performance that we got from DD is similar to what we got through IOZone, and we can see that when we're using one large record sizes, we're really not pushing the IOPS boundaries of this SSD, and so we're pretty much getting close to max on SAS2 speeds. When we start using smaller block sizes, you can see now we're starting to exercise the IOPS capability of the SSD, and so things are obviously much slower on the sequential writes at 4K. As well as random writes at 4K, and they're actually very similar, where random is just slightly, just a tad bit slower, and that may not even be statistically significant difference really. Sequential reads, whether it's 4K or random 4K reads, are basically identical numbers there. So alright, so now that we have the performance number for a single drive, we're going to go ahead and set up a RAID 0 across all 8 drives and then repeat those tests. All right. I am first of all just going to erase everything off that drive, and now let's go ahead and create dev md0 RAID devices 8 devices, RAID 0, we'll assume clean, and this is from SDA through SDH. Alright, and let's go ahead and make a file system. Alright, and I'm going to mount that under MNT again. And so now we have a 3 terabyte RAID 0 under MNT. Alright, so let's start with our DD test. Alright, now we're going to read that file back. Alright, let's go ahead and record that. Alright, so now that we have the DD numbers, we're going to go ahead and run the IO zone test. And this time, because we're using a much larger capacity drive, we're using all 8 in a RAID 0. I'll go ahead and use 1 gigabyte file sizes. So we're going to have a total data set with 32 threads. That's going to give us a total data set of 32 gigabytes of data. All right, that went pretty fast. And if you were watching the numbers as that was happening, you can see that we got some very high performing numbers. All right, next test, we're going to rerun the same thing except using 4K records instead of 1 megabyte to simulate small IO patterns. All right, next test, we're going to stop the RAID array, and we're going to use ZFS to create a RAID Z2 pool. All right, so we have a RAID Z2 pool. I created a data set under /data/test, and we'll go ahead and run the DD test first. All right, here we go. All right, next test is the IO zone test with 1 megabyte records. All right, next we're gonna rerun the IO zone test with 4K record sizes. Hey guys, just want to make a comment here. The random IO performance at 4K is pretty bad right now, and it's taking a long time to run. But I just wanted to point out something. Even though like the random read here is very low here, it looks like something like 80 some megabytes per second. You'll see over here under IO stat, there's actually a lot of IO going on. There's over 200 megabytes written for each SSD, while there's also 120 or over 100 megabytes per read per second of reads happening on the those SSDs as well. So what I think is happening here, especially for the random write test right now, is that the writes are so small. And remember, this is a striped RAID Z2, so and we're using the default ZFS settings, so we have 128K record sizes, and we're writing 4K at a time. And so ZFS is, taking that 4K write request and saying, oh, okay, I have to modify the entire record size. And so in order to do that and recalculate the parity, it's reading the other 124 kilobytes probably, and incorporating the 4 kilobytes of writes, and then recalculating the parity, and then writing all that back to the disks. So I think that's my guess, that's what's happening. That's why we're seeing a lot of reads, even though the current test is a write test, is that we're basically, this is called the the read modify write amplification. And so the actual throughput we're going to see is going to be a lot less, but there's actually a whole lot more activity going on at the hardware level. And so this is one of the drawbacks of kind of this type of setup, when you're writing record sizes that are much smaller than the file system's record size. All right, so this is taking a long time. I'm gonna continue letting it run anyway, and just so we can see what the final result is. But obviously, writing 4K with 128K record sizes is not ideal in this case. If I have the time, in perhaps another video, I might kind of dig into this issue a little bit more to kind of demonstrate how things change if you change the record size on ZFS to kind of cater towards this type of I/O pattern, and what kind of performance boost you can see. All right, guys, finally, that was done. And I probably put on a whole lot extra wear on my SSDs than I really want to. But anyway, I'm doing this for you guys. I'm sacrificing these SSDs for you guys. All right, guys, so these are our final results. So a single SSD in this in the system can do about 500. So you can see that for the sequential or the one megabyte record size, we're really getting more or less the same numbers. And that's because we're probably bound by the bandwidth limitations of SAS2 rather than the IOPS of the SSD. So we're basically maxing out the bandwidth before we can even max out the IOPS. But when we start moving over to smaller record sizes, you can see that now we're starting to see numbers that are much lower, and so we're pushing the limits of the IOPS capability. Now, when it comes to random or the 4K, the reads seem to be about a little bit more than double the write capability, and the random writes and the sequential writes are about the same almost, and similarly with the sequential reads and sequential random reads, it's basically more or less the same. So I think basically we're just IOPS bound at that point. Okay, so when we go to a RAID 0 of 8 of these SSDs, you can see that we definitely scale up quite a bit in the 1 megabyte record, so large file benchmarks. So now it's not scaling linearly exactly, because like the 500 times 8 is about 4,000, right? So we're not really seeing a linear scale. We're seeing something a little bit closer to 4,000 on the sequential reads, but obviously on the sequential writes, it's still a fairly good number, but it's not there. However, if you look at the random writes and random reads, we're basically seeing the same number as the sequential number. And so for example, sequential writes here and random writes here are very, very close, and similarly with the random reads and random writes here. And so this is telling me that we're probably more IOPS bound at this point than we are bandwidth bound. Okay, so when we look at the 4K results, obviously a lot lower, and so we are definitely pushing the limits of the IOPS capability of this RAID0 array. And let's see, but we're seeing a similar result between sequential writes and random writes. And so basically, I mean, the sequential writes are a little bit higher here, but it's very, very close to the random writes. And similarly with the reads, we have 4K sequential reads at about 748, and random read 4K is about almost the same, 554. There's not much difference there. And so again, this is, I think this is just basically IOPS bound at this point, and so we're seeing more or less the same numbers. Okay, so the more interesting part is where we have a RAID Z2 data set of these 8 SSDs, and for whatever reason, the sequential writes are extremely fast here. I don't know if maybe this is a side effect of the copy on write algorithm in ZFS that's kind of manifesting here. I'm not really sure, but we're definitely seeing a lot higher numbers with DD, although read is a little bit slower, and so this is kind of interesting. The SSDs themselves seem to be very performant when it comes to reads over writes, but when we have ZFS RAID Z2 on it, we're a little bit less performant on the reads. Okay, so but that's again DD. Whenever you use DD, really don't take these numbers too seriously. They just kind of give you a ballpark. Okay, so now let's look at the actual IO zone results. And so here we see the sequential writes at 1 megabyte is about 1.5 gigabytes per second, and similarly with the sequential reads at 1 megabyte is very similar, but a little bit higher. Again, when we look at random writes versus sequential writes, we are looking at roughly the same number. And when we look at the sequential reads versus random reads, the random reads is a little bit higher here. Okay, and so now these are 1 megabyte records. So this record size exceeds the default ZFS record size, which is 128K. And so we're seeing pretty good performance here. Okay, now keep in mind this is RAID Z2, so 2 of those SSDs in every stripe is basically lost to parity. And so you can't really expect that to scale as well as a RAID 0, and so obviously we are seeing numbers that are lower than RAID 0. And also that there's the overhead of calculating the parity and all that stuff. Okay, so the interesting part here is when we get to sequential 4K, or the 4K results basically. So sequential writes 4K, sequential read 4K are still fairly decent numbers. However, when we get to random 4K and reads and writes, the numbers plummet. Okay, and I believe that this is the result of basically the record size being much smaller than the benchmark's record size being much smaller than the record size of the ZFS dataset, which is, we didn't modify it, we just kind of set it to its defaults, and that would normally be 128K. And so when we are writing randomly, so random writes means you're writing all over the place, you're not writing in sequence, right? And so when you're writing all over the place, every 4K write lands on a particular stripe, which is 128K, and so ZFS then has to, in order to incorporate that 4K of change, it has to read that whole 28K and modify and then write that back, right? So with sequential, you don't see that type of drop off as badly, because with sequential, if you give it a little bit of time, reading enough 4K blocks in sequence will get you the 120K block, right? And so hopefully, I think ZFS is probably smart enough to kind of allow that to happen, aggregate together, and optimize the operation so that it doesn't have that read modify write amplification as much. But when you're doing random, you could wait all you want, but the likelihood of collecting enough 4K writes to aggregate into the same 128K stripe is not very likely. And so we're really definitely seeing the performance hit really badly here. And so that's, kind of expected with most RAID type setups. But anyway, so those are the numbers. I think they look pretty good. It's more or less kind of in the ballpark of what I was expecting. These SSDs do seem to perform really well on their own. And now keep in mind, these are, if I recall correctly, actually, why don't we just take a quick look at it. Okay, SDA. Okay, yeah, as I suspected, these are native 4K sectors, but with 512 byte sector emulation. So there is a possibility that maybe we can get a little bit better performance if we reformat these to actual 4K sector sizes. That way it matches the actual physical sector size. By the way, a couple of videos ago, I made a video showing you how to reformat the sector sizes on SAS devices. And these are SAS2 SSDs, so it is likely possible to do that here. If you want to learn how to do that, go check out that video. I'll leave a card in the corner for you to go check out how to reformat the sector sizes. Sometimes that can help improve performance, and so maybe in a future video we'll look into kind of comparing how the performance differs or changes when we reformat these two 4K sectors. All right, guys, so that's the end of today's video. We've converted the R820 to a HBA IT mode storage subsystem. We've looked at some performance numbers of what you can kind of expect. Obviously, if you're using a different model SSD that has different performance characteristics, your performance is going to be different than what I've shown today. But this is just to kind of give you a ballpark idea of what you might be able to expect. All right, so in the next video, we're going to take this upgrade a step further, and that will be demonstrating how to take advantage of the direct attach backplane that we have, or that I have in the R820. And if you happen to have an R820 or R720 with a direct attach backplane, you'll be able to take advantage of this so-called trick of the trade, so to speak. Basically, we're going to upgrade to SAS3 storage subsystem, and we'll take a look at what kind of performance benefits we might be able to gain with that in the next video. All right, guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information in this video helpful. If you like this video, be sure to hit that like button. And if you're new to this channel and you like this sort of content, be sure to subscribe. Also, if you want to support my channel, check out my eBay store. I have all sorts of awesome server parts to help you with your server builds. You'll find the links in the video description below. As always, thank you very much for watching and have a great day. Bye-bye.